Hi, and welcome to Just War 101. My name is Brother Logan Isaac. This is a course, a four-part course, mini course, that I gave some time ago at Notre Dame University. And a student recently in my biblical literature class asked me for some material on Just War, and so I thought I'd re-record this, update it just a little bit, and make it available online. So if you're just coming to my channel, Just War 101, Faith and Service as a Christian Citizen, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what Just War is, what it has been, where it originated, how it's used today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how my experience as a Christian soldier and as a veteran affected my understanding and my interpretation of the tradition. And then finally, I'll talk about what the future might hold for Just War if it's going to remain relevant. So first, we're going to talk about Just War Past, how it came to be, and who kind of thought it up. And most scholars will tell you that the first person to create just war theory, just war doctrine, just war tradition, depending on how you refer to it, is St. Augustine of Hippo, who is from North Africa, modern country of Algeria, who lived in the late 4th and early 5th century. His major work, The City of God, the full title of which is The City of God Against the Pagans, was published in the early 5th century. And Augustine at the time, he had a lot of training. He had gotten into a bunch of theological debates with folks around the Roman Empire. And by the time he's writing it, he has witnessed the speeding decline of the Roman Empire. And he is, toward the end of his life, he actually got a little bit more brutish, I suppose, in his theology, because the barbarian hordes, as they were thought of, had sacked Rome, and there was a lot of kind of seemingly dire circumstances that he was responding to by the time he writes City of God. And in the City of God, there's scattered references to this thing he calls jus in bello, or justice in war. Sometimes it's abbreviated just war. And this is where we first see, in the Christian tradition, the appearance of this. So he's borrowing from Roman jurist Cicero in his De Officiis, where he talks about the considerations and the reasons that Rome might go to war, and that a gentleman and an officer might find rationale to be just fine with it. And so Augustine, in City of God, he talks about the relationship between church and state. By the time he's born and kind of begins his own ministry in the late 4th century, the Christian religion had gone from backwater kind of cult to persecuted minority to fully legalized religion. And this occurred in 312 when Emperor Constantine I legalized the religion, and he did more than legalize. He promoted it and felt that it was something that the whole empire might consider embracing. Until that point, part of the reason, or it's debatable, but the emperors were beginning to see the decline of Rome as a result of the gods being mad at them. And the Christians were not faithful in their worship to the Roman gods. They were monotheists, and their inability or unwillingness to worship the gods was making Rome a bad place. So what many emperors did was they persecuted the Christians, tried to get them to worship Roman gods, therefore restore the empire to its former glory. By the 4th century, in Constantine's time, he essentially just says, you know what, let's try something else. Let's just lay off them. And then by his deathbed, there's rumors that he actually was converted and baptized on his deathbed. But during his lifetime, the tide had certainly begun to change, where the persecuted were given access to the centers of power, and those who had formerly been at risk of persecution and suffering could in fact turn that persecution and suffering on others under the guise of faith. And so Augustine is born into this new world where Christianity has just begun to reassess its own relationship with the state. And the City of God is the first major systematic attempt at doing that. And so one of those things that a state does is wage wars. And so Augustine is arguing this is not his main interest, but part of what he does in the City of God is help the church understand what it means to have this power and to wield it responsibly. Then in the 13th century, as the Crusades have begun to die down, they began in the 1090s, I think, or the early 1100s. The church has had power for a long time, and the popular opinion had begun to sway against it. And when Thomas Aquinas enters the scene, there's a growing discontent within the church, which was the Roman Catholic Church was essentially the Western world. There's growing discontent that maybe these dogmas and doctrines that we're supposed to just believe and adhere to because the church says so, there's growing dissatisfaction and protest against it. Again, very slow and over the long haul, but this is beginning to occur when Thomas is born and begins his own ministry and theology. In 1274, he publishes the Summa Theologica, or the Summary of All Theology. And what Thomas does is he employs the scholastic method, which is to ask a question, present some ideas in response to the question, give his answer, and then rebut the answers that he disagrees with. And so the Summa is incredibly systematized, very straight and narrow. This is this is how this works, and blah, blah, blah. And it's important to understand his context as well. Not only had the Crusades kind of come and were beginning to wane in popularity, but also many of his own biological families, brothers, had entered into military careers. In fact, one of the stories that gets passed around about him is that one of or more of his brothers had hired a prostitute that he then had to fight off with a hot poker. And so this cloistered, certainly an introverted, very skilled theologian is reflecting on the world through a theological lens with a very particular perspective on it. And so the Summa was actually a handbook for priests taking confession. It wasn't written for everybody. It wasn't written it was deeply philosophical, but it was by and for the church. And he is, again, drawing on Augustine and Aristotle and others. Among other things, several of his questions pertain to violence and sinfulness and how to deal with it. And he draws on Augustine's earlier work by several centuries to kind of further reinforce what then becomes the Roman Catholic doctrine of just war tradition, which I'll get to in another one of the videos, the later video. Then in the early modern period, the Enlightenment era, we have Hugo Grotius, who's Dutch in the 16th and 17th century. His major work on the law of war and peace was published in 1625. Grotius, in the wider world of academia, is credited with being the father of international law and international relations. He is devout, but he doesn't write theology. He's very much a product of his own environment, which is the emerging Protestant Reformation, which is coupled very closely with the Enlightenment movement. This is a moment when the Catholic Church has lost most, if not all, of its legitimate sway over the Western world, and new ideas and new philosophical constructs are filling the void that was once held by Catholic theology. And so Grotius steps forward as one of these figures to try and make sense of this world that can no longer simply appeal to God and expect that everybody's going to be on the same page. And in our own century, in the last century, the 20th century, we have Paul Ramsey, who's a Protestant ethicist. Among other things, outside the kind of war and peace realm, he's also known as a very skilled and possibly one of the earliest bioethicists. And in 1968, he wrote The Just War, Force and Political Responsibility. And he wrote that in the midst of the emerging Vietnam War. He also wrote during the Civil Rights Movement. He wrote about the ethics of sit-ins, and spent most of his time in Princeton teaching ethics there before he died relatively early, I think in the 80s. And he is credited with reintroducing just war theology, not just to the Protestant world, but to the church in general. He certainly brought that back at a time where it seemed to be needed. And before him, there were others like Reinhold Niebuhr during World War II. And he borrows much from Niebuhr. He studied under Niebuhr, but he kind of takes it to another level and forces this kind of engagement, not just within the Protestant sphere, but within the church as a whole, I think. And then finally, we have Michael Walzer, who wrote Just and Unjust Wars in 1977, just after the Vietnam War had ended. And he actually draws on Jewish traditions and scripture, even though he was a very he's not dead yet, he is a very talented political scientist. For example, he wrote on Exodus and Revolution, and he wrote about the prophets being kind of not civil rights folks, but the value of prophecy in the modern world. He experienced or he witnessed World War II, Vietnam, the Cold War. He's an emeritus professor now from Princeton, just as Ramsey taught at Princeton as well. And these are really just the biggest heavy hitters that write or think and speak about just war. There are plenty of others, some of whom I've studied under, but I wanted to hit like kind of the central figures were in the debate, in the historical debate, in order to introduce the next segment where we'll talk about just war present, and how it's used in the world today, both within the church and in certain areas of statecraft.